So let's continue on with our discussion of VTP operations. Let's talk about the process that happens on a switch when a VTP update is received. And it's a fairly straightforward process. And once you get this process down, then the VTP configuration will flow pretty easily from this knowledge. Number one, it compares the VTP domain in the update to its own. If it doesn't match, just ignore the packet. Just flat out, I'm not even going to forward it along unless it's transparent and it's version 2. I'm just going to completely ignore it if I'm a server or a client and I receive this update. Now, the one exception to this is if my domain name is null and I receive a VTP packet with a configured VTP domain and no password, I will change my VTP domain name to match the domain in the packet I received. And again, when we finally break out to the lab, you'll see this in the lab. We'll configure the VTP domain on one switch, and by the time we can get to the console of the other two, that VTP domain name will already be populated out there. Now, it's important to look at the parameters of this statement. If my domain name is null and I receive a VTP packet that has a domain and no password, if you have a domain and a password, it will not set the local password for you, even if my local domain name is null. Now, you may recall from our overview of VTP that now that I have a valid VTP domain name, I'm a server and I can start sending VTP updates to all of my directly connected switches. So again, be pretty careful when you're connecting a new switch to the network because you could inadvertently change configurations in a way that would not be advantageous to having a functioning network. So once it's looked at the VTP domain name, okay, the VTP domain name matches what I have configured. It checks the password in the VTP update, compares it to what's locally configured. If it doesn't match, ignore the packet. So at this point, we have a good VTP domain name and the password matches. So, okay, I can look further down in this packet now. So next, it looks at the VTP configuration revision. And again, this is a pretty straightforward process as well. If the revision number in the received update is lower than what my local revision number is, just ignore it. I already have a more up-to-date version of the VLAN database, so I'm going to ignore what you're sending me. If the revision number in the received update is higher than my local revision number, throw away my local VLAN database and replace it with the database in the update packet. Now read that statement again very slowly. If what I get is higher than what I have, I'm going to throw away everything I have and override it with what's in the update packet. This is not like a routing protocol where it takes what's in the update and merges it with its local routing table. It absolutely throws it out. And this is what causes the failure scenario. We'll talk about this on the next slide, where if you have a switch that's misconfigured and has a very high revision number and is configured with the proper VTP domain and password, then you'll bring your network to its knees. And let's look at how that happens. So let's assume we have 3 switches here, switch A, switch B, and switch C. I know, very creative. We'll assume for the purposes of this discussion that VTP is functioning normally on all these switches. The domain names and the passwords match. Everything's all hunky-dory. We have these 4 VLANs defined on all 3 of our switches, and we have config revision 12, just to pull a number out of the air. Well, let's say that we need to test something in a lab. So we take switch C and we disconnect it from the network. And we run all of our tests, and by the time we're done with our testing, we end up with a single VLAN on switch C. We end up with VLAN 4, and we end up with config revision 22. So without clearing the VTP configuration by either giving it a null domain name or just deleting the VLAN.dat file entirely and making it like a brand new switch, we just say, okay, well, I'm done with my testing. I'm just going to hook this back up to the network. So we reconnect this link. Switch C then starts sending out VTP updates saying, hey, I've got VLAN 4. My config revision is 22. Now, if you'll recall what we talked about just on the last slide, switch B is going to get this update, and it's going to say, oh, config revision 22, it's higher than what I have config revision 12. So I am just going to throw away my entire VLAN database, like so, and I'm going to replace it with VLAN 4 and config revision 22. At which point, if you have switch ports configured in any of those other VLANs, 10, 11, 12, or 40, all of those ports turn orange on the switch because their access VLAN does not exist on that switch anymore. Anyone that's connected to those switch ports suddenly lose network connectivity. Their network link stays up, but since the switch doesn't know what VLAN to put the traffic on, or more accurately, it doesn't have the VLAN configured to put the traffic on, it just doesn't go anywhere. your phone then explodes because now no one on switch A or switch B can get on the network. This is the failure scenario that I keep harping on about throughout this slide deck. And this is the main reason why most networks I run across do not run VTP. They just have everything set to transparent and don't even use it. Because one misconfigured switch or one rogue attacker can bring down the entire LAN. So now let's talk a bit about VTP pruning. We mentioned that earlier in this slide deck, and this is a pretty simple concept. Here's our three switches, switch A, switch B, and switch C. And this is how the VLANs are configured. Up here on switch A, we have all four VLANs, 10, 11, 12, and 40. However, down here on switch B, we only have 10, 11, and 12. And on switch C, we only have 10 and 40. And that means that there are only hosts in those VLANs. There's only switch ports configured for VLAN 10 on switch C and VLAN 40 on switch C. So in that case, there's no point in sending the broadcast traffic for VLANs 11 and 12 down to switch C. So switch A realizes that, hey, there's only these two VLANs on switch C. I'm just not going to send that traffic for 11 and 12 down this trunk link. Therefore, freeing up resources on this trunk link, freeing up resources on this switch, because this switch would get the broadcast and go, well, I don't have any ports to send it out on, so I'm just not going to send it. Same thing over here for switch B. Switch A will say, well, you don't have VLAN 40 configured, so I'm not going to bother sending any broadcast for VLAN 40. Now, if you go into switch B and you configure a single port for VLAN 40, then it'll start sending the broadcast down. Now, VTP pruning operates kind of in the background. If you were to go on each of these switches, you would actually see VLANs 10, 11, 12, and 40 on all three switches. However, VTP pruning takes place in the background and just blocks those packets from making it down to the switch. And you can look at which VLANs are pruned using the proper VTP commands, which we'll do in the lab. But for the time being, this concludes our discussion of VTP operation.